Good evening. Welcome to Reading Rounds. It is a day. It is August 4th. I was going to say September, but I knew that wasn't right. It is August 4th, 2019. The first Sunday of August. That means that we have a new song. It is called uh Islands by Pyrosion. Excuse me. Islands by Pyrosion. Kind of a kind of a baby making music, but that's all right. Let's take a look at today's Wikipedia front page. The featured article for today is Stephen, King of England, circa 1094 to 1154, who ruled from 1135 until his death. Born in the country of Blois in central France, I'm sure that's Blois or something. He was brought up by his mother Adela, daughter of William the Conqueror. Placed into the court of his uncle Henry I of England, Stephen rose in prominence and was granted extensive lands. When Henry died in 1135, Stephen crossed the English Channel and took the throne in spite of his earlier oaths to support the claim of Henry's daughter, the Empress Matilda. In 1138, the Empress's half-brother Robert of Gloucester rebelled against Stephen, and in 1139, the Empress and Robert invaded England. The revolt took hold in the southwest, and Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141. He was abandoned by many of his followers and lost control of Normandy. He was freed, however, after Robert was captured at the Rout of Winchester, but the civil war dragged on for many years. Upon his death, he was succeeded by the Empress's son, Henry II, the first of the Angevin kings. Let's see here. In the news recently, uh, 30 people are killed and 53 others are injured during a mass shooting in El Paso, Texas, and in Dayton, Ohio. A prison riot in Altamira, Brazil, has left 58 people dead. In cycling, Colombian Egan Bernal has become the first Latin American to win the Tour de France. Incumbent president of Tunisia, Beji Caid Essebsi, dies at the age of 92, and Mohamed Ennacure is named as his interim replacement. On the date of August 5th, on the day in history, August 5th, it is Constitution Day in the Cook Islands and Victory Day in Croatia. On August 5th, 25 AD, Guang Wu claimed the throne as emperor of the Han dynasty after the Wang Mang, who had seized the throne himself and proclaimed the Jin dynasty, died when the peasant rebels besieged Chang'an. In 1689, during the Beaver Wars, aggravated by increased French incursions into their territory, a large force of Mohawk warriors substantially destroyed the settlement of Lachine, New France. In 1772, Russia, Prussia, and Habsburg Austria began the first partition of Poland to help restore the regional balance of power in Eastern Europe among those three countries. In 1864, during the American Civil War, Rear Admiral David Farragut successfully led the Union fleet through a minefield to victory in the Battle of Mobile Bay. In 1949, a magnitude 6.8 earthquake struck near Ambato, Ecuador, killing 5,000 people. Did you know that the philanthropist Mary Robinson Foster was known as the first Hawaiian Buddhist? Lawrence of Arabia's plan to install the Sheriff of Mecca's sons as rulers in what became modern Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and western Saudi Arabia was only partially successful. In 1599, Henry IV of France appointed Humphrey Bradley, Maitre Digues, Master of Dikes of the Kingdom, apparently, in effect a monopoly of all diking and land reclamation work in France. The 2018 art installation We Come in Peace was described as eerie, other, unnerving, ambiguous, and even alarming. Gordon Bell was awarded the Military Cross 31 years before becoming president of the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons. Critics found the couch gag of The Simpsons episode Dad Behavior remarkably grim and bleak, as all but one of the Simpsons characters die during its otherwise familiar title sequence. Interesting. Apparently it's not even a Halloween episode, it's just one of the normal ones as part of the 28th season. Seems like the writers are kind of collapsing in on themselves. Charles Lyon Chandler's biography of Joel Roberts Poinsett went unpublished after two others came out that same year. During the Peasants' Revolt in Cambridge, Marguerite Stair danced with a mob that sacked Corpus Christi College and burnt its charter, shouting, "Away with the learning of clerks! Away with it!" Fun stuff. Looks like Shelby's on the stream. Thanks for coming out. Last time, we read about the super complication. We talked about positive thinking. We talked a little bit about Terry Pratchett, and we read some of the random quotes I have saved in my computer. Riveting stuff. As of late, personally speaking, I've been going through kind of a crazy week. I've had a lot going on. I visited my dentist for a routine checkup. Even though I'm not really having any problems with my teeth, apparently I have an infection on one of my back molars. Really deep into the gum. I don't feel anything, thankfully, but it shows up on the x-rays, and they even double checked, and sure enough, there is something going on there. My dentist thinks that what happened is my tooth has died and that the root has become infected somewhat. I told him I didn't have any pain, but I did mention that some of my sinuses have been acting up this summer. Now I have hay fever, so I just assumed that was hay fever. And I haven't really had a lot of problems with hay fever, so I figured, maybe that my sinuses were closing off and that was just the symptom I was getting. But my dentist, however, thinks that the infection to my tooth, my tooth root, I guess, is actually causing that. He thinks that the infection that comes from that is actually what's closing off my sinuses. So he's recommended me to an endodontologist, I think it is, which is a dentist that just does root canals. So I'm gonna have to give him a call and set up an appointment, get that done. And then I've got two other small cavities I need filled, which should be fun. Um, I'm no longer on any sort of. I turned 26, so I'm no longer on my parents' insurance. So I had to pay for my dental appointment myself, which isn't a terrible deal in and of itself, but I will also have to pay for the root canal and then the small cavity fillings. On top of that, I had to get my oil changed recently and my air filter replaced in that because I was pretty sure I was having troubles with that. Paid rent and I started paying a little bit on my new insurance all within a week, so I've spent about $1,000 this week, all on crap I didn't want. So that's always fun. But at least I'm an adult, I guess. But aside from all that, I guess things are okay. I try not to complain about things, believe it or not. Since complaining doesn't seem to help, it just seems to make me feel worse about things. I'm trying to see the positive side of it. But anyways, I've actually had a root canal before. That was a lot worse though. That tooth was really bothering me, and it had been for some time. And that was an awful experience. I was younger at the time, and I'm sure my pain tolerance has gone up. But no matter what, you're never going to look forward to a root canal. I don't think, especially when you're paying for it. But it's better to get it done with. Oh, thanks for coming out, Tyler. Didn't even send you a link. Um, Good looking out. I am done with my summer class. Pretty sure I got a perfect score in the class, which I'd like to brag about that, but really it's pretty much an easy A. A lot of fun to write for. Um, Unfortunately, didn't really get too much in the way of criticism, except for a poem I wasn't really looking for criticism on because I didn't care that much. Um, but anyways, I've got a lot on my mind. It's been kind of a well, like I say, I don't like to complain about things, but it has been kind of a miserable summer, if I'm being honest. Just because it's so freaking hot, and then all this dental work stuff going on, and been going through some personal struggles lately. I'm doing okay, but uh, life is hard, Life is hard. But I'm not going to dwell on that. I don't think, unless I have nothing else to talk about, which is definitely a possibility. Oh, but there is good news. According to this website, um, it's from boingboing.net, written by Cory Doctorow. I'll just read a little bit of this. I think it's a pretty short article. It says data mining reveals that 80% of books published within 1924 and 1963 never had their copyrights renewed and are now in the public domain. Um, let's see here. This January, we celebrated the grand reopening of the public domain as the onerous terms of the hateful Sony Bono Copyright Act finally developed a leak, putting all works produced in 1923 into the public domain, with more to follow every year. 1924 goes public domain in 2020, and then 1925, etc., etc. But there's another source of public domain works. Until the 1976 Copyright Act, U.S. works were not copyrighted unless they were registered, and then they quickly became public domain unless that registration was renewed. Problem has been to figure out which of these works were in the public domain because the U.S. Copyright Office's records were not organized in a way that made it possible to easily cross-check a work with its registration and renewal. For many years, the Internet Archive has hosted an archive of registration records which were partially machine readable. Entered the New York Public Library, which employed a group of people to encode all these records in XML, making them amenable to automated data mining. Now, Leonard Richardson has done the magical data mining work to affirmatively determine which of the books are in the public domain, which turns out to be 80% of the books of the years mentioned. What's more, many of these books have already been scanned, which uses a limitation in copyright to scan university library holdings for use by educational institutions. So theoretically, if there's anything interesting, we could go ahead and read some public domain stuff that's available. I'm not sure if it'll be anything particularly well, it won't be anything famous, I'm sure. For instance, speaking of dental work, actually, sheer coincidence, the latest post by the bot that was mentioned is titled A History of the American Dental Association, A Century of Health Service. Excuse me. And I'm sure that we are all dying to read that. There's a registration here for King Lear by William Shakespeare. No surprise there that that one's public domain, but see, there's one here that kind of caught my attention called Brothers Divided, a novel by Edmund Fuller, 1914. Or rather, it was published in 1951. Edmund Fuller was born in 1914. I was hoping that perhaps there was a way to read it. Looks like perhaps not. So it seems like even though there's plenty of books available, it may not be that any of them are actually readable by us, of course. Nothing in life is easy. Hmm. Here's something that's kind of interesting. It's a book called Aldo Icardi, American Master Spy, and it is written by Aldo Icardi. Interesting. Apparently, he worked for according to the subject's description on the digital library, he worked for the United States Secret Service during World War II. Aldo Icardi. Maybe I can find a copy of that somewhere. It's kind of ridiculous to me that a book can be public domain, but then all the ebook versions still charge for it. I feel like that's. I know this is perhaps me uh, overreacting, but it does feel a little bit like robbery, taking something that should be free and charging for it. It's like paying someone to use the water fountain, you know? Let me see here. I suppose we could. He does have a Wikipedia article. Perhaps we could just read about that a little bit. I'm sure that alone should be at least somewhat interesting. Or perhaps he doesn't have a Wikipedia article. Truly a master spy, covering his tracks like this. Let's see here. There is a description for the book. It says here, Aldo Icardi was a United States Army second lieutenant during World War II, who was sent as a specially trained soldier by the United States Army's Office of Strategic Services on a special mission to enemy-occupied territory in Italy to organize resistance movements. During this mission, which was codenamed Chrysler, its commander, Major John Williams V, oh, John Williams V. Holohan, disappeared, and Lieutenant Icardi, along with the radio operator Carl G. Lodolce and three Italians, were charged with his murder. The Italians, who spent 3 years in jail, were later acquitted, and Icardi and Lodolce were convicted in absentia of murder and sentenced to life and 17 years, respectively. But neither man could be extradited back to Italy, so did not serve time. In 1955, Icardi was indicted by a federal grand jury for perjury, but was acquitted in 1956. The Italian communist commander Vincenzo Moscatelli later admitted that he was responsible for Major Holohan's death and that Icardi had nothing to do with it. With this book, which was first published in 1954, Aldo Icardi seeks to set the record straight on all the newspaper stories that circulated in the wake of the killing and ever since. Kind of seems like his real crime was just not actually doing anything. Create a Wikipedia page for him. There is another public domain book here called Dwarf Fruit Trees for Home Gardens by Isaac B. Lucas. I'm sure that we would all love to read that one. Let's see here. There's one here called The Warden by Anthony Trollope. Interesting. This one actually does have the full version available for free on Google. It's actually an English book, and it's apparently popular enough that it's in the Google says that it's in my local Salt Lake County Library services, or not local library, but the county services anyway. It's got a 3.7 out of 5 on Goodreads. Let's take a look at a synopsis here. The warden concerns Mr. Septimus Harding, the meek elderly warden of Hiram's Hospital and precentor of Barchester Cathedral in the fictional county of Barsetshire. Hiram's Hospital is an almshouse supported by a medieval charitable bequest to the Diocese of Barchester. The income maintains the almshouse itself, supports its 12 bedesmen. Interesting. Apparently, a bedesman or a beadsman was generally a pensioner or almsman whose duty it was to pray for his benefactor. So somebody would give him money and then he would pray for them. It's a strange little thing, but okay. In addition, provides a comfortable abode and living for its warden. Mr. Harding was appointed to this position through the patronage of his old friend, the Bishop of Barchester, who is also the father of Archdeacon Grantley, to whom Harding's older daughter, Susan, is married. The warden, who lives with his remaining child and unmarried younger daughter, Eleanor, performs his duty conscientiously. Story concerns the impact upon Harding and his circle when a zealous young performer, John Bold, launches a campaign to expose the disparity in the appointment of the charity's income between its object, the beadsman, and its officer, Mr. Harding. John Bold embarks on this campaign in a spirit of public duty, despite his romantic involvement with Eleanor and previously cordial relations with Mr. Harding. Bold starts a lawsuit, and Mr. Harding is advised by the indomitable Dr. Grantley, his son-in-law, to stand his ground. Sounds riveting. That wasn't uh, the entire synopsis, but I think I was about to fall asleep and I was the one reading it. Ah, here's one thing that might actually be interesting to us. Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. I don't actually know the story of Sleepy Hollow. I'm familiar with it, but not enough to actually know anything about it. Let's see here. Yes, the full book is available on Google, which is nice. Well, I suppose we could go ahead and read this one. This one's completely public domain. Let's see, how long is this book? 100 pages or so? 200 pages. But of course, we won't be reading the whole thing, but, well, certainly. Take a look at this one. Now then. Righto. Let's take a look at Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. From Harvard University Library at the bequest of Edward Ray Thompson, Troy, New York. I don't know if this is what Americans sound like. Let's see, what is the caption for this illustration? Whenever he went dodging about the village, he was surrounded by a troop of children. Oh, who doesn't love children? Pay attention because this does actually have illustrations if you're at all interested. And before I forget about that, let me see if I can go ahead and create a highlight for this. Now then, let's begin. Rip Van Winkle. The caption on this illustration is, and he fell into a deep sleep. Preface. To me, a whilom wanderer and sketcher along and about the banks and shores and hills, and a drifter over the wide waters of the Hudson River, there was always a something in the very air and nature of the places that seemed to film over the landscape with a hazy atmosphere of romance. The distant lines of the Catskill Mountains seemed as rhythmic as a hymn to the eternal. In those days it was not any ordinary mountain range in our eyes. There were many higher and more pretentious, but these blue hills were to us the home of the elves and the fays, and even the goblins. I well remember the stress I went to get this sketch-book of Washington Irving, which was meant to me a book of sketches, or a book to draw in, and my dismay to find it merely a book of short stories. And the possession they took of me when I read them, and the bewitchment of my sketching companion when he too had read them, and our going off not once but many times to explore and sketch the then enchanted hills that were almost in sight of our own windows. It was not so very long ago, but long enough I fear to have suffered the raw winds of the late tempests of realism to blow away much of what it would now scream at as the very fogs and mists of the ideal. The fact hunter has been over the enchanted ground with his hissing searchlight. The up-to-datiest has brought his most cunning kodak and gone for the haunts of the elves and fairies. Every scrap of airy romance will be damped and dragged over the slide of Professor Hardfax's microscope. And, saddest thing of all, there is a depressed little band of painters of the unlovely who have no words but of scorn and pity for what they unmeaningly call the Hudson River School, forgetting that the Hudson River has inspired some of the noblest landscapes and the most purely American that the country has ever produced. Let us hope, however, that the spirits of the romance-haunted hills will be too subtle and evasive for any yet invented machine of the chill realist. They will laugh at the futile efforts of those serious creatures whose eyes have been so dimmed with overstraining their narrow vision that they let the elves play inside their instruments while they poke about in the shadowy hills with their electric bull's eye. When the sketchbook, containing Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, was given to the world, the Catskills were very little known, especially the parts wherein the first story is laid to what might be now termed the summer visitor. A very few in search of quiet and the pure mountain air managed to climb to the simple little inns and farmhouses in the higher regions, and in order to get there a creaking old stagecoach managed to devote as many hours as the new cogwheel railway will do the distance in minutes, almost while the nervous passengers are holding their breath in fear and trembling. I do well remember a certain fearsome vehicle, part coach, part wagonette, part omnibus, that creaked its slow way with us up the winding mountain road, every moment threatening its disintegration, but it was picturesque, and of its race as racy as it dared. The regions to which it took us still bore many interesting reminders of the somewhat mixed nationalities of the early settlers of the mountains. Dutch and English and Indian names of people and things and places intermingled in a most sociable and picturesque but somewhat confusing, bewildering way. Whatever wars and disputes there may have been, they had managed to come together into a delightful conglomerate. The Indian named streamlet would flow into a Dutch named ravine, and the little river would take a Dutch baptism before it gurgled under the English-looking bridge and past the very English-named village of Leeds, on past the Dutchest of village, Catskill, and Catskill Landing. There is some want of unanimity about this latter name, not about the kill as it is common in Dutch terminology for all the streams that empty into the Hudson River, but on the old maps it is Cats. In Irving's time it became Cots or Catter, and it is now always Catskill. The Leeds folks claimed that their very village was the home of the real and veritable Rip, and show various tumble-down tenements in some places, and the remains of weed-covered foundations in other places to prove their assertions. Naturally, the Dutch villagers of Catskill scout this claim, and hurl charges of the usual sort against England's greed of possession. However, there was nothing like mortal bloodshed over the dispute, as far as I could gather at the time. The Dutch took their revenge in every sort of trade except horse-flesh, and in that they swore roundly that the English and Yankees more than turned the fortunes of war against them. The old stone bridge at Leeds, of which I give the faint reproduction of a boyish sketch, looked as if it might have been bodily stolen from some ancient English village. It is probably the most archaic thing of its kind in that part of America, and in fact it is quite venerable and uncanny enough to have made a good third with the Twa Briggs at Ayr, immortalized by Robert Burns. Indeed, it has about it much of the witch-ridden suggestiveness of that other haunted bridge over that hail fellow of Rip's, Tam O'Shanter, ended his wild ride pursued by Cutty Stark and her weird sisters. There is a certain scenery of which one can easily believe any tale of crime or devilry, fairy lore or romance, that local tradition or invention cares to invested with, and to all such places will some day come the poetic soul with insight and sympathy. The fays and elves have been watching for him, and have led his footsteps to their revel grounds, and have told their secrets and sung their songs to him. The spirits of this region must have met Washington Irving more than halfway, and the rest was like play to him. How real and living are all the people of his fancy! Compare them with the lay figures which he conjured up in the sad hours of his later years in the dusty libraries of Spain, when he tried to be a writer of serious history, like the life of Columbus. These opaque realities are but, quote, things of shreds and patches, unquote, beside the undying creatures he made to live and breathe from the shadowy films of fancy caught in his own romance-haunted regions. Of all the author's work, serious and humorous, the fact is, most of his work was such a happy mixture of the two elements that it puzzled his more serious readers to tell where the blend came in. Rip Van Winkle took the most immediate and lasting grip of his public. The sketchbook was written, except two of the sketches, during the author's sojourn in England, and after having been offered to a publisher and declined, the MS was sent to his brother in America, and in 1819 the book appeared simultaneously in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The success was so immediate and widespread that the fame of it induced the Murrays to soon publish an English edition. This was almost immediately followed by other European editions. I have one of the Paris editions before me, published by Galignani, with the autograph of Teresa Giocchioli G. Did Lord Byron give it to her? On the title page. A very palpable instance of the story's popularity in its author's lifetime took the form of the largest and most imposing of the Hudson River passenger steamers. Nothing had ever been so vast and palatial, and along its great dome of a paddle-box might be read, miles away, the name of Rip Van Winkle. This was fame indeed, and the name of the Knickerbocker, for the sister boat of equal gorgeousness, came as further recognition and tribute to the author's character and greatness. To do honor to the author himself, they renamed the village near his home on the Hudson Irvington, and other honors, more than his modest nature could accept, were offered to him in abundance. Indeed, the story of his quiet, successful afterlife is one touched with his own sunshine and poetry. Living within daily sight of these great steamers, one wonders if he did not often in fancy see the spirit of the departed Rip now and again rejoining this shady crew of ninepin playing, Hollands tippling spooks whom he knew but too well. And the party may have looked down on the gliding palace with its thousand lights winding along the broad Hudson beneath them. And in the scarcely concealed bewilderment of the wild buccaneering crew at this flaring advertisement of the simple creature whom they fuddled with their ghostly liquor and left in forgetfulness to sleep it off, perhaps they may have asked him in amazement, mingled with ghostly envy, what on earth he had done to deserve all this, and no doubt the delightful but still dazed reprobate can only reply that he merely slept in peace and quiet while the rest of mankind on the American continent were warring and battling, flying hither and thither, consuming themselves in cyclones of nervous energy. He, perhaps of all others, was the only perfectly quiet and happy soul, left with nothing to go on with but a breath of suspended animation. Are these spooks of the departed buccaneer so envious of Rip's success in snatching deathless fame in a fuddled sleep that they have never since then been tempted to show any like attraction to any other wandering scapegrace with a gun and a taste for even ghostly Hollands? Perhaps, for though there were many, there may have been the likely scapegrace, with a more than likely thirst, this charming history has never, even in this age of plagiarism, repeated itself. Perhaps the succeeding Rips have not had the great redeeming charms of the original, his love of and sympathy with children. Nothing can be more exquisite than the delicate and tender touch with which his loving historian adorns and brightens his otherwise rather casual character. Lazy and dreamy as he was ever wakeful and alert enough to join them and help them in all their children's games. He would show the truant school urchin how to put on the wriggling worm or grasshopper so that it would never fail to notice the wariest of perch or gudgeon. Indeed, I believe it is that side of his character that has enticed me to imagine more incidents of his urchin sympathy than his author has put down to him. But to any one disposed to blame me on this account, I may urge that I have not sketched half the scenes that crawl in me, almost clamoring to be drawn. One can easily forgive the little frailties of poor Rip for the many kindly, even precious qualities of his very defects. He might be regarded less of a casual, careless, irresponsible idler than a dreamy protest against the stress and drive, the feverish energy and over-excitement in the wild race against them, for wealth and power and place in the quickly growing communities about him. After all, it was no crime, if he saw more good in life, to loaf and invite his soul, as Walt Whitman sings. He may have seen a more lovely blue in the heavens, reflected in the quiet pools as he fished away the hours, with some entranced urchin looking on. The kites and soap bubbles that he taught them to send skywards may have carried some lesson unseen by his scolding wife. The very games he taught the children to play made them merrier and better, and stronger to bear the avenging birch of the schoolmaster. And as he slept away the long years, old time was good enough to pass him by, forgetting and forgiving. The horrors of war had passed over the land, and spared him its sorrows and penalties. He had the consolation for many meanwhile losses to awake to the new order that brought, among other blessings, freedom and peace. This preface was written by Geo H. Boughton. And there is an illustration here of the old stone bridge at Leeds in the Catskill Mountains, as mentioned earlier in the preface. So that was the beginning part of this story. And this book contains the legend of Sleepy Hollow in the latter half, but the first half is Rip Van Winkle. I'm going to take a break. It's only been about 40 minutes, but I'd like to give my voice a chance to rest a little bit. And then we will start on Rip Van Winkle properly. Let's see here. I think I can save this. Yes. So the nice thing about Google is that you can just go ahead and save these sorts of things to your account. I'm going to take a quick break. I'll be right back in just a moment. Don't you go dying on me. Okay, and welcome back. I had neglected to mention before we go on to Rip Van Wink. Um, I have been reading a book recently. Uh, I was lent a book by my boss at work. It's a nonfiction account called The Last Lecture. Um, so a tradition academia is that when a professor retires or something or other, they give their last lecture where they kind of reflect on their career and all that. In this case, what happened was this professor at Carnegie Mellon, he was, I think, in his late 40s, and he had terminal cancer, pancreatic cancer. And so he decided to give a literal last lecture. Um, and so he kind of told the story a bit about his life and how he achieved his childhood dreams. And then, so it's sort of an account of that. It's not as depressing as it sounds, actually, which is what makes it interesting. But the guy, the lecturer, he's or he was, I guess, an interesting fellow. Very bullheaded, to put it nicely. But it's always interesting to get some fresh perspectives and see some nonfiction accounts. Um, I would definitely recommend it if you're at all curious. It's very short. It's a lecture, um, not some epic tome or something like that. But anyways, I digress. Let's return to Rip Van Winkle. Now, looking at this, I don't think there are any chapters, but it looks like the text is a bit larger. So hopefully, we can see. Much better. Hopefully, it will be easy enough to read. Um, that preface was a bit dense, honestly, but I feel like yes. If you're looking at all, it seems like there's a lot more text fit on. Let's see here. And again, there are some illustrations here, so if you're at all curious, be sure to look at them. I don't want to describe them because that'd be weird if anybody's just. Well, I guess I could try and describe some of them. I probably won't, but I mean, how do you describe a naked woman reaching out of a well? She's covered in ropes and she's holding up like a mirror or something, and there's a pilgrim who's over there like trying to draw her before she covers herself up. At least I assume that's what it is. And there's a writing here. The caption on the picture is by Woden, god of Saxons, and there's an engraving in the picture itself that says, "By Woden, god of Saxons, from whence comes Wednesday, that is Woden's day. Truth is a thing that ever I will keep until Thilk? What? Until Thilk day, in which I creep into my sepulchre." Cartwright. Oh yes, there it is. In fact, hold on. I need to start over. Yes, Tyler's saying no chapters. That is strange. It is a bit strange. I guess people in those days just did not believe in chapters. We're going to try again. This is Rip Van Winkle, a posthumous writing of Diedrich Knickerbocker. Quote, "By Woden, god of Saxons, from whence comes Wednesday, that is Woden's day. Truth is a thing that ever I will keep unto thy day in which I creep into my sepulchre. Unquote, by Cartwright. The following tale was found among the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker, an old gentleman of New York, who was very curious in the Dutch history of the province and the and the manners of the descendants from its primitive settlers. His historical researches, however, do not lie so much among books as among men, for the former are lamentably scanty on his favorite topics, whereas he found the old burghers, and still more their wives, rich in that legendary lore so invaluable to true history. Whenever, therefore, he happened upon a genuine Dutch family, snugly shut up in its low-roofed uh, farmhouse under a spreading sycamore, he looked upon it as a little class volume of black letter, and studied it with the zeal of a bookworm. The result of all these researches was a history of the province during the reign of the Dutch governors, which he published some years since. There have been various opinions as to the literary character of his work, and, to tell the truth, it is not a whit better than it should be. Its chief merit is in its scrupulous accuracy, which indeed was a little questioned on its first appearance, but has since become completely established, and is now admitted into all historical collections as a book of unquestionable authority. The old gentleman died shortly after the publication of his work, and now that he is dead and gone, it cannot do much harm to his memory to say that his time might have been much better employed in weightier labors. He, however, was apt to ride his hobby his own way, and though it did now and then kick up the dust a little in the eyes of his neighbors, and grieve the spirit of some friends for whom he felt the truest deference and affection, yet his errors and follies are remembered, "more in sorrow than in anger," and it begins to be suspected that he never intended to injure or offend. But, however his memory may be appreciated by critics, it is still held dear among many folks, whose good opinion is well worth having, particularly certain biscuit bakers, who have gone so far as to imprint his likeness on their New Year's cakes, and have thus given him a chance for immortality almost equal to the being stamped on a Waterloo medal or a Queen's Anne farthing. Whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. They are a dismembered branch of the great Appalachian family, and are seen away to the west of the river, swelling up to a noble height, and lording it over the surrounding country. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed every hour of the day, produces some change in the magical hues and shapes of these mountains, and they are regarded by all the good wives, far and near, as perfect barometers. When the weather is fair and settled, they are clothed in blue and purple, and print their bold outlines on the clear evening sky. But sometimes, when the rest of the landscape is cloudless, they will gather a hood of gray vapors about their summits, which, in the last rays of the setting sun, will glow and light up like a crown of glory. At the foot of these fairy mountains, the voyager must have descried the light smoke curling up from a village, whose shingle roofs gleam among the trees, just where the blue tints of the upland melt away into the fresh green of the nearer landscape. It is a little village of great antiquity, having been founded by some of its Dutch colonists in the early times of the province, just about the beginning of the government of good Peter Stuyvesant, may he rest in peace, and there were some of his of the houses of the original settlers standing within a few years, built as small yellow bricks brought from Holland, having latticed windows and gable fronts surmounted with weathercocks. In that same village, and in one of those very houses which, to tell the precise truth, was sadly time-worn and weather-beaten, there lived many years since, while the country was yet a province of Great Britain, a simple good-natured fellow of the name of Rip Van Winkle. He was a descendant of the Van Winkles, who figured so gallantly in the chivalrous days of Peter Stuyvesant, and accompanied him to the siege of Fort Christina. He inherited, however, but little of the martial character of his ancestors. I have observed that he was a simple, good-natured man. He was, moreover, a kind neighbor, and an obedient hen-pecked husband. Indeed, to the latter circumstances might be owing that meekness of spirit which gained him such universal popularity, for those men are most apt to be obsequious and conciliating abroad, who are under the discipline of shrews at home. Their tempers, doubtless, are rendered pliant and malleable in the fiery furnace of domestic tribulation, and a certain lecture is worth all the sermons in the world for teaching the virtues of patience and long-suffering. A termagant wife may therefore, in some respects, be considered a tolerable blessing, and if so, Rip Van Winkle was thrice blessed. Certain it is that he was a great favourite among all the good wives of the village, who, as usual with the amiable sex, took his part in all family squabbles, and never failed, whenever they talked those matters over in their evening gossips, to lay all the blame on Dame Van Winkle. The children of the village, too, would shout with joy whenever he approached. He assisted at their sports, made their playthings, taught them to fly kites and shoot marbles, and told them long stories of ghosts, witches, and Indians. Whenever he went dodging about the village, he was surrounded by a troop of them, hanging on his skirts, clambering on his back, and playing 1,000 tricks on him with impunity, and not a dog would bark at him throughout the neighborhood. The great error in Rip's composition was an insuperable aversion to all kinds of profitable labor. It could not be from the want of assiduity or perseverance, for he would sit on a wet rock with a rod as long and heavy as a Tartar's lance, and fish all day without a murmur, even though he should not be encouraged by a single nibble. He would carry a fowling piece on his shoulder for hours together, trudging through swamps and woods, and up hill and down dale, and to shoot a few squirrels or wild pigeons. He would never refuse to assist a neighbor, even in the roughest toil, and was a foremost man at all country frolics, for husking Indian corn or building stone fences. The women of the village, too, used to employ him to run their errands, and to do such odd jobs as their less obliging husbands would not do for them. In a word, Rip was ready to attend to anybody's business but his own. But as to doing family duty and keeping his farm in order, he found it impossible. In fact, he declared it was of no use to work on his farm. It was the most pestilent little piece of ground in the whole country. Everything about it went wrong, and would go wrong in spite of him. His fences were continually falling to pieces. His cow would either go astray or get among the cabbages. Weeds were sure to grow quicker in his fields than anywhere else. The rain always made a point of setting in just as he had some outdoor work to do, so that though his patrimonial estate had dwindled away under his management, acre by acre, until there was little more left than a mere patch of Indian corn and potatoes, yet it was the worst condition farmed in the neighborhood. His children, too, were as ragged and wild as if they belonged to nobody. His son Rip, an urchin begotten in his own likeness, promised to inherit the habits with the old clothes of his father. He was generally seen trooping like a colt at his mother's heel, equipped in a pair of his father's cast-off gaskins, which he had much ado to hold up with one hand, as a fine lady does her train in bad weather. Rip Van Winkle, however, was one of those happy mortals of foolish, well-oiled dispositions who take the word easy, eat white bread or brown, whichever can be got, with least thought or trouble, and would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. If left to himself, he would have whistled life away in perfect contentment, but his wife continually dinning in his ears about his idleness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing on his family. Morning, noon, and night, her tongue was incessantly going, and everything he said or did was sure to produce a torrent of household eloquence. Rip had but one way of replying to all the lectures of the kind, and that, by frequent use, had grown into a habit. He shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, cast up his eyes, but said nothing. This, however, provoked a fresh volley from his wife, so that he was fain to draw off his forces, and would and take to the outside of the house, the only side which, in truth, belongs to a henpecked husband. Rip's sole domestic adherent was his dog Wolf, who was as much henpecked as his master, for Dame Van Winkle regarded them as companions in idleness, and even looked upon Wolf with an evil eye, as the cause of his master's going so often astray. True it is, in all points of spirit befitting an honourable dog, he was as courageous an animal as ever scoured the woods. For what courage can withstand the ever-during and all-besetting terror of a woman's tongue? The moment Wolf entered the house his crest fell, his tail drooped to the ground or curled between his legs. He snuck about with a gallows air, casting many a sidelong glance at Dame Van Winkle, and at the least flourish of a broomstick or ladle he would fly to the door with yelping precipitation. Times grew worse and worse with Rip Van Winkle as years of matrimony rolled on. A taut temper never mellows with age, and a sharp tongue is the only edged tool that grows keener with constant use. For a long while he used to console himself, when driven from home, by frequenting a kind of perpetual club of the sages, philosophers, and other idle personages of the village, which held its sessions on a bench before a small inn, designated by a rubicund portrait of His Majesty George III. Here they used to sit in the shade of a long, lazy summer's day, talk listlessly over village gossip, or tell endless sleepy stories about nothing. But it would have been but it would have been worth any statesman's money to have heard the profound discussions that sometimes took place, when by chance an old newspaper fell into their hands from some passing traveller. How solemnly they would listen to the contents, as drawled out by Derrick Van Bummel, the schoolmaster, a dapper, learned little man, who was not to be daunted by the most gigantic word in the dictionary, and how sagely they would deliberate upon public events some months after they had taken place. The opinions of this junto were completely controlled by Nicholas Vedder, a patriarch of the village and landlord of the inn, at the door of which he took his seat from morning till night, just moving sufficiently to avoid the sun, and keep in the shade of a large tree, so that the neighbors could tell the hour by his movements as accurately as a sundial. It is true he was rarely heard to speak, but smoked his pipe incessantly. His adherents, however, for every great man has his adherents, perfectly understood him, and knew how to gather his opinions. When anything that was read or related displeased him, he was observed to smoke his pipe vehemently, and sent forth short, frequent, angry puffs. But when pleased, he would inhale the smoke slowly and tranquilly, and emit it in light and placid clouds, and sometimes taking the pipe from his mouth, and letting the fragrant vapour curl about his nose, would gravely nod his head in token of perfect approbation. From even this stronghold the unlucky Rip was at length routed by his termagant wife, who would suddenly break in upon the tranquillity of the assemblage, and call the members all to naught. Nor was that august personage, Nicholas Veeder himself, sacred from the daring tongue of this terrible virago, who charged him outright with encouraging her husband in habits of idleness. Poor Rip was at last reduced almost to despair, and his only alternative to escape from the labour of the farm and the clamour of his wife was to take gun in hand and stroll away into the woods. Here he would sometimes set himself at the foot of a tree and share the contents of his wallet with Wolf, with whom he sympathized as a fellow-sufferer in persecution. "Poor Wolf," he would say, "thy mistress leads thee a dog's life of it, but never mind, my lad, whilst I live thou shalt never want a friend to stand by thee." Wolf would wag his tail, look wistfully in his master's face, and if dogs can feel pity, I verily believe he reciprocated the sentiment with all his heart. In a long ramble of the kind on a fine autumnal day, Rip had unconsciously scrambled to one of the highest parts of the Catskill Mountains. He was after his favourite sport of squirrel shooting, and the still solitudes had echoed and re-echoed with the reports of his gun. Panting and fatigued, he threw himself, late in the afternoon, on a green knoll covered with mountain herbage that crowned the brow of a precipice. From an opening between the trees he could overlook all the lower country for many a mile of rich woodland. He saw at a distance the lordly Hudson far, far below him, moving on its silent but majestic course, with the reflection of a purple cloud, or the sail of a lagging bark, here and there sleeping on its glassy bosom, and at last losing itself in the blue highlands. On the other side he looked down into a deep mountain glen, wild, lonely, and shagged, the bottom filled with fragments from the impending cliffs, and scarcely lighted by the reflecting rays of the setting sun. For some time Rip lay musing on this scene. Evening was gradually advancing. The mountains began to throw their long blue shadows over the valley. He saw that it would be dark before long, before he could reach the village, and he heaved a heavy sigh when he thought of encountering the terrors of Dame Van Winkle. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice from a distance hallooing, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" He looked around, but could see nothing but a crow winging its solitary flight across the mountains. He thought his fancy must have deceived him, and turned again to descend, when he heard the same cry ring through the still evening air, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" At the same time Wolf bristled up his back, and giving a low growl, skulked to his master's side, looking fearfully down into the glen. Rip now felt a vague apprehension stealing over him. He looked anxiously in the same direction, and perceived a strange figure slowly toiling up the rocks, and bending under the weight of something he carried on his back. He was surprised to see any human being in this lonely and unfrequented place, but supposing it to be some one of his neighbourhood in need of his assistance, he hastened down to yield it. On nearer approach he was still more surprised at the singularity of the stranger's appearance. He was short, square-built old fellow, with thick bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His dress was of the antique Dutch fashion, a cloth jerkin strapped around his waist. Several pair of breeches, the outer one of ample volume, decorated with rows of buttons down the side, and bunches at the knees. He bore on his shoulder a stout keg that seemed full of liquor, and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the load. Though rather shy and distrustful of this new acquaintance, Rip complied with his usual alacrity, and mutually relieving each other, they clambered up the narrow gully, apparently the dry bed of a mountain torrent. As they ascended, Rip every now and then heard rolling peals, like distant thunders, that seemed to issue out of a deep ravine, or rather cleft between lofty rocks, toward which their rugged path conducted. He paused for an instant, but supposing it to be the muttering of one of those transient thunder showers which often take place on the mountain heights, he proceeded. Passing through the ravine, they came to a hollow, like a small amphitheater, surrounded by perpendicular precipices, over the brinks of which impending trees shot their branches, so that you only caught glimpses of the azure sky and the bright evening cloud. During the whole time, Rip and his companion had labored on in silence, for though the former marveled greatly what could be the object of carrying a keg of liquor up this wild mountain, yet there was something strange and incomprehensible about the unknown that inspired awe and checked familiarity. On entering the amphitheater, new objects of wonder presented themselves. On a level spot in the center was a company of odd-looking personages playing at ninepins. They were dressed in a quaint, outlandish fashion. Some wore short doublets, others jerkins, with long knives in their belts, and most of them had enormous breeches of similar style with that of the guides. Their visages, too, were peculiar. One had a large head, broad face, and small piggish eyes. The face of another seemed to consist entirely of nose, and was surmounted by a white sugar-loaf hat, set off with a little red cock's tail. They all had beards of various shapes and colors. There was one who seemed to be the commander. He was a stout old gentleman, with a weather-beaten countenance. He wore a laced doublet, broad belt and hanger, high-crowned hat and feather, red stockings, and high-heeled shoes with roses in them. The whole group reminded Rip of those figures in an old Flemish painting in the parlor of Dominie van Schaik, the village parson who had been brought over from Holland at the time of the settlement. What seemed particularly odd to Rip was that though these folks were evidently amusing themselves, yet they maintained the gravest faces, the most mysterious silence, and were, withal, the most melancholy party of pleasure he had ever witnessed. Nothing interrupted the stillness of the scene but the noise of the balls which, whenever they were rolled, echoed along the mountains like rumbling peals of thunder. As Rip and his companion approached them, they suddenly desisted from their play, and stared at him with such fixed statue-like gaze, and such strange, uncouth, lacklustre countenances, that his heart turned within him, and his knees smote together. His companion now emptied the contents of the keg into large flagons, and made signs to him to wait upon the company. They obeyed with fear and trembling. He obeyed with fear and trembling. They quaffed the liquor in profound silence, then returned to their game. By degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided. He even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the beverage, which he found had much of the flavor of excellent Hollands. He was naturally a thirsty soul, and was soon tempted to repeat the draught. One taste provoked another, and he reiterated his visits to the flagon so often that at length his senses were overpowered, his eyes swam in his head declined gradually, and he fell into a deep sleep. On waking, he found himself on the green knoll, from whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright, sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes, and the eagle was wheeling aloft and breasting the pure mountain breeze. Surely, thought Rip, I have not slept here all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep. The strange man with a keg of liquor, the mountain ravine, the wild retreat among the rocks, the woe-begone party at ninepins, the flagon. Oh, that flagon! That wicked flagon! Thought Rip. What excuse shall I make to Dame Van Winkle? He looked round for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found an old firelock lying by him, the barrel encrusted with rust, and the lock falling off, and the stock worm-eaten. He now suspected that the grave roysters of the mountain had put a trick on him, and having doused him with liquor, had robbed him of his gun. Wolf, too, had disappeared, but he might have strayed away after a squirrel or partridge. He whistled after him and shouted his name, but all in vain. The echoes repeated his whistle and shout, but no dog was to be seen. He determined to revisit the scene of last evening's gamble, and if he met with any of the party, to demand his dog and gun. As he rose to walk, he found himself stiff in the joints and wanting in his usual activity. These mountain beds do not agree with me, thought Rip, and if this frolic should lay me up with a fit of rheumatism, I shall have a blessed time with Dame Van Winkle. With some difficulty he got down into the glen. He found the gully up which he and his companion had ascended the previous evening. But to his astonishment, a mountain stream was now foaming down it, leaping from rock to rock, filling the glen with babbling murmurs. He, however, made shift to scramble up its sides, working his toilsome way through thickets of birch, sassafras, and witch hazel, and sometimes tripped up or entangled by wild grapevines that twisted their coils and tendrils from tree to tree, and spread a kind of network in his path. At length he reached to where the ravine had opened through cliffs to the amphitheatre, but no traces of such opening remained. The rocks presented a high, impenetrable wall, over which the torrent came tumbling in a sheet of feathery foam, and fell into a broad, deep basin, black from the shadows of the surrounding forest. Here, then, poor Rip was brought to a stand. He again called and whistled after his dog. He was only answered by the cawing of a flock of idle crows, sporting high in air about a dry tree that overhung a sunny precipice, and who, secure in their elevation, seemed to look down and scoff at the poor man's perplexities. What was to be done? The morning was passing away, and Rip felt famished for want of his breakfast. He grieved to give up his dog and gun. He dreaded to meet his wife, but it would not do to starve among the mountains. He shook his head, shouldered the rusty firelock, and with a head full of trouble and anxiety, turned his steps homeward. As he approached the village he met a number of people, but none whom he knew, which somewhat surprised him, for he had thought himself acquainted with everyone in the country round. Their dress, too, was of a different fashion from that to which he was accustomed. They all stared at him with equal marks of surprise, and whenever they cast eyes upon him, invariably stroked their chins. The constant recurrence of this gesture induced Rip involuntarily to do the same, when, to his astonishment, he found his beard had grown a foot long. He had now entered the skirts of the village. A troop of strange children ran at his heels, hooting after him and pointing at his grey beard. The dogs, too, not one of which he recognized for an old acquaintance, barked at him as he passed. The very village was altered. It was larger and more populous. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before, and those which had been in his familiar haunts had disappeared. Strange names were over the doors, strange faces at the windows. Everything was strange. His mind now misgave him. He began to doubt whether both he and the world around him were not bewitched. Surely this was his native village, which he had left but the day before. There stood the Catskill Mountains. There ran the Silver Hudson at a distance. There was every hill and dale precisely as it had been. Rip was sorely perplexed. That flagon last night, thought he, has addled my poor head sadly. It was with some difficulty that he found the way to his own house, which he approached with silent awe, expecting every moment to hear the shrill voice of Dame Van Winkle. He found the house gone to decay, the roof fallen in, the windows shattered, and the doors off the hinges. A half-starved dog that looked like Wolf was skulking about it. Rip called him by name, but the cur snarled, showed his teeth, and passed on. This was an unkind cut indeed. My very dog, sighed poor Rip, has forgotten me. He entered the house, which, to tell the truth, Dame Van Winkle had always kept in neat order. It was empty, forlorn, and apparently abandoned. This desolateness overcame all his connubial fears. He called loudly for his wife and children. The lonely chambers rung for a moment with his voice, and then all again was silence. He now hurried forth and hastened to his old resort, the village inn, but it too was gone. A large rickety wooden building stood in its place, with great gaping windows, some of them broken, mended with old hats and petticoats, and over the doors was painted "The Union Hotel" by Jonathan Doolittle. Instead of the great tree that used to shelter the quiet little Dutch inn of yore, there now was reared a tall naked pole with something at the top that looked like a red nightcap, and from it was fluttering a flag on which was a singular assemblage of stars and stripes. All this was strange and incomprehensible. He had recognized on the sign, however, the ruby face of King George, under which he had smoked so many a peaceful pipe, but even this was singularly metamorphosed. The red coat was changed for one of blue and buff, A sword was held in the hand instead of a scepter, and the head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters, General Washington. There was, as usual, a crowd of flock about the door, but none that Rip recollected. The very character of the people seemed changed. There was a busy, bustling, disputatious tone about it, and instead of the accustomed phlegm and drowsy tranquillity, he looked in vain for the sage Nicholas Vedder, and with his broad face, double chin, and fair long pipe, uttering clouds of tobacco smoke instead of idle speeches, or Van Bummel, the schoolmaster, doling forth the contents of an ancient newspaper. In places of these, a lean, bilious-looking fellow, with his pockets full of handbills, was haranguing vehemently about rights of citizens, election, members of Congress, liberty, Bunker's Hill, heroes of '76, and in other words that were a perfect Babylonian jargon to the bewildered Van Winkle. The appearance of Rip, with his long grizzled beard, his rusty fowling piece, his uncouth dress, and the army of women and children that had gathered at his heels, soon attracted the attention of the tavern politicians. They crowded round him, eyeing him from head to toe with great curiosity. The orator bustled up to him, and drawing him partly aside, inquired on which side he voted. Rip stared in vacant stupidity. Another short but busy little fellow pulled him by the arm, and rising on tiptoe, inquired in his ear whether he was Federal or Democrat. Rip was equally at a loss to comprehend the question, when a knowing, self-important old gentleman in a sharp cocked smile made his way through the crowd, putting them to the right and left with his elbows as he passed, and planting himself before Van Winkle, with one arm akimbo, the other resting on his cane. His keen eyes and his sharp hat penetrating, as it were, into his very soul, demanded in an austere tone what brought him to the election with a gun on his shoulder and a mob at his heels, and whether he meant to breed a riot in the village. "Alas, gentlemen!" cried Rip, somewhat dismayed, "I am a poor quiet man, a native of the place, and a loyal subject of the king. God bless him!" And here a general shout burst from the bystanders. "A Tory! A Tory! A spy! A refugee! Hustle him! Away with him!" It was with great difficulty that the self-important man in the cocked hat restored order, and having assumed a tenfold austerity of brow, demanded again of the unknown culprit what he came there for, and whom he was seeking. The poor man humbly assured him that he meant no harm, but merely came in there in search of some of his neighbors who used to keep about the tavern. "Well, who are they? Name them." Rip bethought himself a moment, and inquired, "Where's Nicholas Vedder?" There was a silence for a while. Then an old man replied in a thin, piping voice, "Nicholas Vedder? Why, he is dead and gone these 18 years. There was a wooden tombstone in the churchyard that used to tell all about him, but that's rotted and gone too. Where's Brom Doctor?" "Oh, he went off to the army in the beginning of the war. Some say he was killed at the storming of Stony Point. Others say he was drowned in a squall at the foot of Anthony's Nose. I don't know. He never came back again." "Where's Van Bummel, the schoolmaster?" "He went off to the wars too, was a great militia general, and is now in Congress." Rip's heart died away at hearing of these sad changes in his home and friends, and finding himself thus alone in the world. Every answer puzzled him, too, by treating of such enormous lapses of time, and of matters which he could not understand. War, Congress, Stony Point. He had no courage to ask after any more friends, but cried out in despair, "Does anybody here know Rip Van Winkle?" "Oh, Rip Van Winkle!" exclaimed two or three. "Oh, to be sure, that's Rip Van Winkle yonder, leaning against the tree." Rip looked, and beheld a precise counterpart of himself as he went up the mountain, apparently as lazy and certainly as ragged. The poor fellow was now completely confounded. He doubted his own identity, whether he was himself or another man. In the midst of his bewilderment, the man in the cocked hat demanded who he was, and what was his name. "God knows," exclaimed he, at his wit's end. "I'm not myself. I'm somebody else. That's me yonder. No, that's somebody else got into my shoes. I was myself last night, but I fell asleep on the mountain, and they've changed my gun, and everything's changed, and I'm changed, and I can't even tell what's my name or who I am." The bystanders began now to look at each other, nod, wink significantly, and tap their fingers against their foreheads. There was a whisper also about securing the gun, and keeping the old fellow from doing mischief. at the very suggestion of which the self-important man in the cocked hat retired with some precipitation. At this critical moment a fresh-looking woman pressed through the throng to get a peep at the grey-bearded man. She had a chubby child in her arm, which, frightened at his looks, began to cry. "Hush, Rip!" cried she. "Hush, you little fool! The old man won't hurt you." The name of the child, the air of the mother, the tone of her voice, all awakened a train of recollection in his mind. "What is your name, my good woman?" asked he. "Judith Gardenier." "And your father's name?" "Ah, poor man, his name was Rip Van Winkle. It's 20 years since he went away from home with his gun, and never has been heard of since. His dog came home without him, but whether he shot himself or was carried away by the Indians, nobody can tell. I was then but a little girl." Rip had but one more question to ask, and he put it with a faltering voice. "Where's your mother?" "Oh, she too had died but a short time since. She broke a blood vessel in a fit of passion at a New England peddler." There was a drop of comfort, at least, in this intelligence. The honest man could contain himself no longer. He caught his daughter and her child in his arms. "I am your father," cried he. "Young Rip Van Winkle once, old Rip Van Winkle now. Does nobody know poor Rip Van Winkle?" All stood amazed, until an old woman, tottering out from among the crowd, put her hand to her brow, and peering under it in his face for a moment, exclaimed, "Sure enough, it is Rip Van Winkle. It is himself. Welcome home again, old neighbor. Why, where have you been these long 20 years?" Rip's story was soon told, for the whole 20 years had been to him as one night. The neighbors stared when they heard it. Some were seen to wink at each other and put their tongues in their cheeks, and the self-important man in the cocked hat who, when the alarm was over, had returned to the field, screwed down the corners of his mouth and shook his head, upon which there was a general shaking of the head throughout the assemblage. It was determined, however, to take the opinion of old Peter Vanderdonk, who was slowly advancing up the road. He was a descendant of the historian of that name, who wrote one of the earliest accounts of the province. Peter was the most ancient inhabitant of the village, and well versed in all the wonderful events and traditions of the neighborhood. He recollected Rip at once, and once more on the bench at the inn door, and was reverenced as one of the patriarchs of the village, and a chronicler of the old times before the war. It was some time before he could get into the regular track of gossip, or could be made to comprehend the strange events that had taken place during his torpor. How that there had been a revolutionary war, that the country had thrown off the yoke of old England, and that, instead of being a subject of His Majesty Majesty George III, he was now a free citizen of the United States. Rip, in fact, was no politician. The changes of states and empires made but little impression on him. But there was one species of despotism under which he had long groaned, and that was petticoat government. Happily, that was at an end. He had got his neck out of the yoke of matrimony, and could go in and out whenever he pleased, without dreading the tyranny of Dame Van Winkle. Whenever her name was mentioned, however, he shook his head, shrugged his shoulders, and cast up his eyes, which might pass either for an expression of resignation to his fate, or joy at his deliverance. He used to tell his story to every stranger that arrived at Mr. Doolittle's hotel. He was observed, at first, to vary on some points every time he told it, which was doubtless owing to his having so recently awakened. It at last settled down precisely to the tale I have related, and not a man, woman, or child in the neighborhood but knew it by heart. Some always pretended to doubt the reality of it, and insisted that Rip had been out of his head, and that this was one point on which he was always remained flighty. The old Dutch inhabitants, however, almost universally gave it full credit. Even to this day, they never hear a thunderstorm of a summer afternoon about the Catskill, but they say Hendrik Hudson and his crew are at their game of ninepins, and it is a common wish of all henpecked husbands in the neighborhood, when life hangs heavy on their hands, that they might have a quiet draught out of Rip Van Winkle's flagon. Note, the foregoing tale, one would suspect, had been suggested to Mr. Knickerbocker by a little German superstition about the Emperor Frederick der Rothbart and the Kripphauser Mountains. The subjoined note, however, which he had appended to the tale, shows that it is an absolute fact, narrated with his usual fidelity. The story of Rip Van Winkle may seem incredible to many, but nevertheless I give it my full belief, for I know the vicinity of our old Dutch settlements to have been subject to marvelous events and appearances. Indeed, I have heard many stranger stories than this in the villages along the Hudson, all of which were too well authenticated to admit of a doubt. I have even talked with Rip Van Winkle myself, who, when last I saw him, was a very venerable old man, and so perfectly rational and consistent on every other point that I think no conscientious person could refuse to take this into the bargain. Nay, I have seen a certificate on the subject taken before a country justice and signed with a cross in the justice's own handwriting. The story, therefore, is beyond the possibility of doubt. Well, that's the story of Rip Van Winkle. The version I remember of the story was that he had somehow gone into like a kingdom under the sea, and that he partied for like 100 years or something, got out and found that he had not aged during that time. They gave him a box as like a party favor, a going away present, and told him never to open it. But because his whole family was gone, he was bored and he didn't have anything to do but to open the thing. And when he did, it caused him to age all that time that he had lost. Well, I like that story. I especially like the beginning, the description of his village and the world he lived in. It was very vivid. Very vivid. Took us about a half hour to read that one. Next time, we will get on with the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which I don't know really anything about. I know a little bit about the concept of a Dullahan, which is like a headless horseman, but I don't know anything about the actual legend. So we'll see that, but I do really like the writing style of this one. Um, so we'll look forward to that next time. Basically, Rip Van Winkle is what you'd call an American fairy tale, which is a lot of fun, very fitting for this show. Anyways, I hope you all have a good night, a good week. Uh, uh, duh, uh, uh, duh.